The moment my father called me a decorated failure in front of our entire family, I made a decision. That night, I walked out straight onto Air Force One. By the time he realized what I'd done, his texts begging for forgiveness were already on read. This is how I went from the family disgrace to the one person they could never control. The dining room table was set for a celebration: crisp white linens, polished silverware, the kind of spread that only happened when my father wanted to impress someone. Tonight, it was for my brother Liam. Again. He'd just been promoted to captain, and the family had gathered at my parents' sprawling Virginia estate to toast his latest achievement. I'd flown in from DC straight from a debriefing, still in my dress uniform, my mind still half-tangled in the classified details of a mission I couldn't discuss. Not that anyone would have asked. I stood in the doorway for a second, watching them. My father at the head of the table, broad-shouldered and stern, his Marine Corps posture never relaxing, not even at home. My mother, elegant as always, laughing at something Liam said. My sister, Naomi, scrolling through her phone, probably checking on a patient. And Liam, grinning, already 3 drinks in, soaking up the attention like he always did. No one noticed me until I stepped forward. Sienna. My mother's smile was warm, but her eyes flicked to my father, like she was waiting for his reaction before deciding how to feel about my presence. "You're late," my father said, not looking up from his wine. "Flight was delayed," I said, keeping my voice even. I didn't mention that the delay had been because of last-minute revisions to a national security report I'd been ordered to finish before leaving. That would have been an excuse, and in this house, excuses were weaknesses. Liam smirked. "Still working that desk job?" I didn't answer. I didn't tell him that my desk job had me briefing generals, that my reports went straight to the Secretary of Defense, that just last week, I'd been in a room where decisions were made that would shape the next decade of foreign policy. None of that mattered here. Hey, beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from? My father stood, raising his glass. "To Liam," he said, his voice booming. Another step toward the legacy this family was built on. Glasses clinked. Liam looked smug. Naomi gave me a half-apologetic glance before lifting her own drink. Then my father's eyes cut to me. "And to Sienna," he added, his tone shifting lighter, almost mocking. "My decorated failure." The words hung in the air like a slap. For a second, no one moved. Then Liam snorted into his drink. My mother's smile tightened, but she didn't say a word. Naomi looked down at her plate. I could have corrected him. I could have listed every commendation, every classified operation, every time I'd been told my work had saved lives. But I knew how that would go. He'd call it bragging. He'd say real soldiers didn't need to talk about their accomplishments. He'd twist it until I looked like the insecure one. So I didn't react. I just sat there, my back straight, my face blank, while the conversation moved on like nothing had happened. But something had happened. That moment, those 3 words cut deeper than any battlefield insult ever could. Because this wasn't some stranger dismissing me. This was my own father, in front of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, reducing years of sacrifice to a punchline. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn his approval, only to realize too late that the game was rigged. No matter what I did, it would never be enough. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because in his eyes, I was playing the wrong role entirely. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Laughter, stories about Liam's latest exploits, my father's booming voice filling the room. I didn't contribute. I just watched, detached, like I was studying an enemy formation. By the time dessert was served, I'd made my decision. I excused myself early, claiming fatigue. No one argued. Upstairs, in my old bedroom, still untouched, still frozen in time like a museum exhibit of the daughter they'd expected me to be, I packed my bag. Not everything. Just enough. Then I pulled out my phone and sent a single text. 3 words. The same number he'd used to break me. "I'm in. Tonight." The reply came instantly. "Wheels up in 2 hours. Don't be late." I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam the door. I just walked out, my medals silent in their case, my uniform still pressed, my head held high. And as the car pulled away from the house, I didn't look back. Not even once. The laughter that followed my father's words didn't come from strangers or rivals, it came from my own family. That was what made it cut so deep. My brother Liam's smirk was the first thing I registered, that familiar look of smug satisfaction he'd worn since we were kids, whenever our father's disapproval landed on me instead of him. Then came the uncomfortable chuckles from my uncles, the kind of forced amusement people default to when they don't know how to react, but don't dare contradict the man at the head of the table. My mother's silence was worse. She didn't laugh, but she didn't defend me either. She just took a slow sip of wine, her eyes darting away from mine, as if she could will the moment to pass by sheer politeness. I had spent years in military intelligence learning to read rooms, to spot the slightest shift in tone or body language that signaled danger. Right now, every signal was screaming. This wasn't just a passing joke. This was a public erasure. My father wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his scotch like this was just another casual dinner conversation. You know, Sienna, if you'd gone into a real combat role instead of hiding behind security clearances, maybe you'd have something to show for yourself by now. The words were calculated. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had spent his entire career breaking people down in debriefings, and he was using those same tactics on me now, undermining my credibility in front of an audience so no one would ever take my side. Liam seized the opening. Yeah, sis, when was the last time you even fired a weapon? Or do they not let you near those in your little office job? I could have corrected him. I could have told them about the classified training exercises, the overseas deployments, undercover identities, the fact that my little office job involved strategizing missions that Liam would never be cleared to know about. But that would have been playing right into their game. Defending myself would only make me look defensive. So I stayed silent, my face impassive, while they traded barbs like I wasn't even there. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the way the room accepted it. My aunt tried to change the subject to Naomi's latest medical conference, but even that felt like a dismissal, like my humiliation was just an awkward bump in the conversation to be smoothed over. No one demanded an apology. No one even looked uncomfortable. They were all so used to this dynamic, so conditioned to see me as the disappointment, that my father's words might as well have been a weather report. Just another fact of life. Liam, the golden child. Sienna, the afterthought. I had faced enemy interrogators who showed more respect. Dessert was served, some elaborate chocolate torte my mother had ordered for the occasion, and the conversation shifted to Liam's upcoming assignment. I watched as my father clapped him on the back, the pride in his voice so stark it was almost painful. I had heard that tone exactly once in my life, years ago, when I graduated top of my class at West Point. It had lasted until he found out I was choosing intelligence over infantry. Then it vanished, replaced by the quiet disdain, the constant implication that I had taken the easy way out. The irony was almost funny. He called my work a desk job, as if poring over satellite intel to prevent terrorist attacks was somehow less vital than kicking down doors. As if the weight of decisions that could save or cost lives was something to scoff at. But logic didn't matter here. This wasn't about facts. This was about narrative. And in my family's narrative, I was the cautionary tale. The one who could have been great if only I'd followed the script. By the time coffee was poured, I had stopped listening. I was too busy memorizing the details, the way my father's ring tapped against his glass when he emphasized a point, the way Liam leaned in like he was already rehearsing the stories he'd tell his buddies later. I had spent my career analyzing patterns, and this one was crystal clear. Nothing I did would ever be enough. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because they needed me to be the failure. It made the rest of them look better. When I finally stood to leave, no one protested. My mother gave me a perfunctory hug and whispered, "Don't take it so personally," as if there was any other way to take it. My father didn't even look up from his conversation. Upstairs, I packed my bag with methodical precision. Not the frantic, emotional rush of someone running away, the deliberate movements of someone executing a mission. Because that's what this was. A tactical retreat. And I had just identified my enemy. The first time my father called me a disappointment, I was 17 years old and holding my West Point acceptance letter. I remember how the paper trembled in my hands, not from nerves, but from the sheer adrenaline of victory. I'd spent 4 years killing myself to get here, perfect grades, varsity track team captain, student government, all while listening to my father tell anyone who would listen that the military isn't for girls who can't handle real combat. That day, I thought proving him wrong would finally change things. He took the letter from me without smiling, his eyes scanning the embossed header like he was verifying its authenticity. Then he handed it back with a sigh. "You know, intelligence is the only branch they'll let women excel in," he said. "Don't get your hopes up for frontline work." That was the moment I understood the rules of the game. It wasn't about achievement. It was about his definition of achievement. The memory played in sharp relief as I drove away from the family estate that night, the hum of the car engine the only sound in the tense silence. I could still feel the phantom weight of my dress uniform jacket, the way the fabric stretched across my shoulders when I'd stood at attention during my first promotion ceremony. My father had shown up late. He'd spent the entire reception telling war stories to Liam's friends while my commanding officer tried to compliment me within earshot. West Point had been worse. While Liam got weekend passes to visit home during his academy years, I spent my first Christmas break alone in the barracks. "Your brother needs the family support more," my mother had said on the phone, her voice tinny with distance. What she meant was that Liam was struggling academically, socially, while I was thriving. And in our family, struggling meant you deserved attention. Excelling meant you didn't need it. I flexed my fingers on the steering wheel, forcing myself to focus on the road. The past was a minefield, and tonight wasn't the time to get lost in it. But the memories kept coming, unstoppable. There was the time I'd aced my survival training, 3 days in the woods with no food, no shelter, just a knife and a compass, only to have my father ask if they'd gone easy on the female candidates. There was the deployment I'd volunteered for, the one that left me with a scar along my ribs and a medal I couldn't display because the operation was classified. When I'd returned home, my father had taken Liam out for steaks to celebrate his new promotion. No one had asked about my limp. The pattern was clear now, obvious in hindsight. Every time I'd accomplished something remarkable, my father had found a way to diminish it. Every time I'd suffered, he'd turned away. And the few times I'd failed, the training exercise I'd barely passed, the mission where intel had been wrong, he'd weaponized those moments like they were the only truths that mattered. The worst part? I'd let him. I'd spent years internalizing his narrative, believing that if I just worked harder, just achieved more, he'd finally see me. It had taken tonight's dinner, that casual, public dismissal, to make me realize the truth. He didn't want to see me. The version of me he'd constructed in his head, the disappointment, the decorated failure, was too useful. It made Liam look better by comparison. It gave him a story to tell at parties. It let him pretend the military was still the boys' club he remembered. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Admiral Halsey's name flashed on the screen. ETA? I checked the clock. 90 minutes until wheels up. Plenty of time. As I merged onto the highway, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about me. This was about every woman who'd ever been told her service was secondary, every soldier who'd been mocked for working behind the scenes instead of on the front lines. My father wasn't just dismissing me, he was dismissing the entire modern military, the one where analysts prevented wars just as effectively as infantry fought them. And that, I realized with cold clarity, was his fatal mistake. Because while he'd been busy writing me off, I'd been building something he couldn't ignore. A reputation in intelligence circles that had reached the highest levels of government. A network of allies who valued results over bravado. A career that didn't need his approval to matter. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. Somewhere beyond it, Air Force One waited. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't driving toward my father's expectations. I was driving away from them. The truth about my career had been hiding in plain sight for years, buried beneath layers of classification and my father's willful ignorance. But as the black government sedan pulled through the gates of Joint Base Andrews, I realized something with startling clarity. My silence had been my own prison. I had followed protocol, kept secrets, swallowed every backhanded compliment about my desk job because that's what good soldiers did. But good soldiers also knew when intelligence had been compromised, and the false narrative my family believed about me was a national security risk of its own. Admiral Halsey met me on the tarmac, her sharp eyes scanning me like she was assessing a recruit. "You look like hell," she said by way of greeting. "I just survived a dinner with General Voss," I replied. That made her snort. "Then you're combat ready." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a 4-star admiral who had seen my classified service record, who knew exactly what I'd sacrificed and achieved, and she treated me with more respect than my own father ever had. As we boarded the sleek military jet that would take us to meet Air Force One, I thought about all the reports I'd filed, the briefings I'd delivered, the operations I'd planned that had saved lives without a single shot fired. None of it had been good enough for him, because in his world, valor only counted if it left blood on your uniform. The jet's cabin was quiet, the hum of engines a familiar comfort. Halsey handed me a file. "Read this. You'll need it for the briefing." I flipped it open. Inside was a dossier on a foreign operative, one I'd spent 6 months tracking. My father's words from dinner slithered back. "If you'd gone into a real combat role, maybe you'd have something to show for yourself." My fingers tightened on the file. This operative had been responsible for 2 attempted embassy bombings. Because of my work, we'd stopped both. Hundreds of lives saved. 0 casualties. And yet, in my father's eyes, that meant nothing compared to Liam's single Turk kicking down doors in a conflict we all knew was political theater. Halsey was watching me. "Problem, Voss." I closed the file, just realizing how deep the misinformation goes. She leaned back, a knowing look on her face. "Let me guess. They still think you're a paper pusher." It was worse than that. They thought I was a failure. A glorified secretary playing soldier. The family embarrassment who couldn't hack it in the real military. All while I'd been building a career so sensitive, even most generals weren't cleared to know the details. The jet banked sharply, and through the window, I saw Air Force One gleaming under the runway lights. The sight should have filled me with pride. Instead, all I felt was a simmering anger, not at my family's ignorance, but at my own complicity in it. I'd been so careful to follow the rules, to never boast, to never correct their assumptions. And in doing so, I'd let them craft a narrative that erased everything I'd done. Halsey's voice cut through my thoughts. "You know why the president requested you personally?" I shook my head. "Because 3 months ago, you identified a sleeper cell no one else had spotted. Because last year, your analysis prevented an assassination attempt on a NATO official." She tapped the file in my hands. "And because tomorrow, you're going to brief the National Security Council on how to dismantle this network before they strike again." The weight of her words settled over me. This wasn't just validation, it was proof that the official story my family believed was a lie. Not because the truth was classified, but because they'd never bothered to ask the right questions. As we taxied toward the waiting presidential plane, I made a decision. The era of silent acceptance was over. If my father wanted to believe in his fictional version of me, that was his choice. But I was done letting that fiction dictate my worth. The file in my hands wasn't just an intelligence brief. It was a receipt. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to start showing them. The moment my dress shoes touched the polished floor of Air Force One, I made a conscious decision. I would not call my family. Not when we reached cruising altitude. Not when we landed. Not when the photographs of me standing beside the president inevitably surfaced online. For the first time in my life, I understood the power of absence, the way an empty chair at the table could speak louder than any argument. Admiral Halsey had warned me about this moment during our flight. "They'll expect hysterics," she'd said, sipping black coffee as dawn broke through the cabin windows. "They'll wait for the emotional outburst, the tearful accusations. When it doesn't come, that's when they'll start to panic." She was right. My father's entire playbook relied on reaction, on me scrambling to defend myself, to prove my worth, to beg for scraps of approval. But what happens when the dog stops begging? I turned my phone to airplane mode before takeoff. Not because I feared their calls, but because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing those notifications go unanswered. Let them wonder. Let them check flight trackers when news broke about the president's unscheduled stop in Germany. Let my brother comb through press pool photos looking for my familiar silhouette among the staff. The silence would be my weapon now, cold, precise, and utterly deafening. Back home, they'd be constructing their narratives without me. My father would tell the relatives I'd always been too sensitive. My mother would murmur about stress and overwork. Liam would make jokes about desk jockeys playing pretend. None of them would consider the simplest explanation, that I had finally become exactly what they'd always accused me of being, someone who didn't need their validation to matter. The White House Communications Office handed me a prepared statement about my routine advisory role. When reporters asked why an unknown intelligence officer appeared in the president's entourage, I approved it without comment. The vagueness served my purposes better than any grand revelation. Ambiguity was a hall of mirrors, and I wanted them stumbling through it for weeks. In the air somewhere over the Atlantic, I drafted a single email to my sister Naomi, the only family member who'd ever sent me articles about women in military intelligence with no ulterior motive. The message contained exactly 12 words. I'm safe. I'm not coming back. You can reach me here. I included a Proton mail address I'd created years ago and never used. Then I deleted the draft without sending it. Not yet. Timing was everything. The strategic withdrawal wasn't about running away, it was about repositioning forces. While my family obsessed over why I'd left, I'd be 2 steps ahead, building alliances they couldn't undermine. The NSC briefing wasn't just another assignment, it was my beachhead. Every official in that room would remember the quiet woman who predicted the attack vectors 3 months before the CIA's own estimates. Reputation was currency in Washington, and I was done letting my family counterfeit mine. By the time we landed at Ramstein Air Base, a curious thing had happened. The anger that had fueled my departure had burned away, leaving something colder and more durable in its place. I watched the president shake hands with German defense officials and realized with clinical detachment that my father would have sold his soul to stand where I was standing right now. The knowledge should have tasted sweet. Instead, it just was. That night, in the sterile quiet of a military base VIP quarters, I finally opened the encrypted folder Halsey had given me. Inside were performance evaluations from my last 5 assignments, each one glowing, each one signed by generals whose names even my father respected. At the bottom of the stack lay a single sheet of paper with no letterhead, containing just 3 sentences. They'll never see you clearly until you stop standing in their light. The choice is yours. RH. I slid the documents back into their envelope. Outside, a security detail shuffled past my door. Somewhere beyond the base perimeter, my old life continued without me. Family dinners where my name would be carefully avoided, holiday photos with a conspicuous gap where I should have been. Let them have their fragile peace. I had a war to win. The next morning, when the White House photographer captured the now iconic image of the president's security team, me standing at his left shoulder, crisp in my service dress, I made sure to turn slightly away from the camera. Just enough that my father would recognize me instantly, but not enough for him to ever claim I was looking back. The date stamp was clearly visible, 6 months after my father had told his golf buddies I'd washed out of meaningful service. As dawn crept through the bunker's reinforced windows, I assembled the complete dossier. Not as a weapon, not yet, but as insurance. The military had taught me that the most powerful leverage wasn't what you used, but what you could prove you had. Let them continue their charade. Let them tell their stories about my undistinguished career. Every condescending remark, every pitying glance, every family gathering where they pretended I'd never served with distinction only strengthened my position. The true power of these documents wasn't in their content, but in their existence. My father had built his narrative on the assumption that my work was too classified to verify or too insignificant to matter. He'd gambled that secrecy would keep me silent. But the military keeps records, meticulous, unforgiving records, and now those records were mine. I locked the binders in a secure briefcase, the combination known only to me. There would come a moment, a promotion announcement, a public ceremony, perhaps a chance encounter at the Army-Navy game, when their disbelief would become unsustainable. And when that moment arrived, I wouldn't need to say a word. The proof would speak for itself, in the language my family claimed to revere above all others, official documentation on Department of Defense letterhead. As I walked out into the morning light, my phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert about the President's upcoming visit to CENTCOM headquarters. My name appeared halfway down the list of accompanying staff. Somewhere in Virginia, I knew my father would be staring at that same notification, struggling to reconcile it with everything he believed about my career. Let him struggle. The truth was no longer my burden to prove. It was his to explain. The Pentagon cafeteria smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, the same as it had for decades. I sat at a corner table with Colonel Elias Tripp Montgomery, a grizzled Special Forces veteran who had no business knowing my name, let alone requesting this meeting. His hands, scarred from 3 decades of combat deployments, cradled a chipped mug bearing the faded insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. "I served with your old man in Fallujah," Montgomery said without preamble. His voice carried the gravel of too many sandstorms and shouted orders. Greatest tactical mind I ever saw. Also the most stubborn son of a bitch this side of the Potomac. He took a deliberate sip of coffee, watching me over the rim. "He's still telling people you're some kind of glorified secretary?" The question hung between us, loaded like a weapon. I kept my expression neutral, but my fingers tightened around my own cup. Montgomery chuckled at my silence. "Relax, Voss. If I was here to carry water for Danny, I'd have brought a bucket." He reached into his fatigues and slid a folded photograph across the table. The edges were worn soft from handling. The image showed my father standing with his unit in Iraq, circa 2004. But it wasn't the young version of Dad that caught my attention, it was the officer standing beside him, unmistakably Montgomery 20 years younger, arms slung casually around my father's shoulders. And tucked under Montgomery's other arm, a dog-eared copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War with post-it notes jutting from the pages. "See that book?" Montgomery tapped the photo. "Your dad borrowed it in '04 and still hasn't returned it. Bastard annotates in pen too." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Point is, I know how Danny's mind works better than most. And I know exactly why he can't admit what you've become." A busboy clattered trays nearby, giving me an excuse to pause before responding. "And what is that, sir?" Montgomery's grin showed teeth. "Better than him." He unfolded a second photo. This one recent, showing me standing beside Admiral Halsey during a counterterrorism briefing at MacDill. Danny spent his career believing real soldiers eat dirt and take bullets. The idea that his daughter is out there winning wars with a fucking PowerPoint presentation? That breaks his brain. He slid a manila envelope toward me. Inside were performance evaluations from my time at Cyber Command, each one signed by Montgomery himself in his capacity as liaison officer. The comments section on the most recent one read, "Major Voss's predictive analysis of insurgent movements prevented 2 confirmed Kias last quarter. Her work doesn't just support the fight, it changes its very nature." I stared at the words, my throat unexpectedly tight. These weren't the vague commendations buried in my personnel file. These were combat veterans putting in writing that my work had directly saved lives. Montgomery stood abruptly, chair scraping against linoleum. "Halsey says you're assembling some kind of dossier." He dropped a business card on top of the envelope. The phone number on it was handwritten, different from the official Pentagon line printed below his name. "When you're ready to drop the hammer, call that number. I've got 3 retired generals who'd love to explain to your father exactly what classified intelligence work really means." He was halfway to the door when I found my voice. "Why?" Montgomery turned, his smile gone. "Because the military's changing, boss. And men like your dad." He jerked a thumb toward the portrait of George Washington hanging by the cashier. "They're about as relevant as powdered wigs." The envelope contained one final surprise, a photocopied page from my father's personal journal, dated the week I graduated West Point. In handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, he'd written, "Sienna ranked top 5%. They're offering her any branch she wants." Christ, why couldn't she have been a boy? The night of the dinner, I paused before the mirror in my apartment. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the daughter my father remembered. My hair, once kept ruthlessly short for field exercises, now skimmed my collar in a sleek bob. The uniform fit like a second skin, every medal and ribbon testifying to a career he'd refused to acknowledge. Most importantly, my posture held none of the defensive tension I'd carried at family gatherings. Tonight, I wasn't pleading for approval. I was displaying evidence. The ballroom erupted in camera flashes as I entered on the president's arm. I'd expected nerves, but instead felt an eerie calm, the same focus that steadied me before high-stakes briefings. We passed tables where senators and network anchors openly stared. At table 7, a defense correspondent from the Washington Post leaned to his colleague and whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. The way his eyes dropped to my chest. Not leering, but searching for the name tape he clearly recognized, told me everything. Dinner passed in a blur of practiced small talk and strategically timed smiles for the photographers. When the president rose to give his remarks, the room fell silent. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated, a casual reference to the unsung heroes in intelligence who connect dots before they become tragedies. He didn't name me, but as he spoke, the Jumbotron camera zoomed in on our table, freezing my reaction for the entire ballroom and the C-SPAN audience to see. My phone buzzed incessantly in my clutch purse throughout the evening. I didn't need to check it to know who was calling. By midnight, the notifications showed 17 missed calls from my parents' landline, 3 from Liam, and a single text from Naomi, "You absolute legend." Dad's pacing the study like a caged tiger. I waited until 3 a.m., when I knew my father would be alone with his scotch, to respond. Not with words, but with an attachment, the official White House photo of me standing at attention beside the president, my medals gleaming under the chandeliers. The caption read, "Major Sienna Voss, Senior Intelligence Advisor to the National Security Council." I sent it without comment, then turned off my phone. The response came 3 days later via certified mail, a manila envelope containing every letter I'd ever sent from boot camp, every photograph of us together at military functions, even the crayon drawings I'd made as a child of Daddy's soldier friends. No note. No apology. Just these artifacts of a relationship he no longer knew how to voice. I stored the envelope in my safe beside the dossier Montgomery had helped me compile. Some battles weren't won with explosions, but with silence, the kind that forced others to sit with what they'd done. At our next NSC briefing, Admiral Halsey slid a newspaper across the table. The style section featured a photo from the dinner with the headline, "The most interesting person at the correspondence dinner wasn't a celebrity." She didn't smile, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Your father called the Pentagon press office yesterday," she said. "Demanded to know why he hadn't been informed about your promotion." I folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. What did they tell him? Halsey adjusted her uniform jacket. "That classified personnel matters are need to know." She paused. "And that he no longer had clearance." The meeting moved on to drone strike assessments and budget allocations, but I barely heard the discussion. Somewhere in Virginia, a retired general was finally learning the limits of his influence. And his daughter, once the family embarrassment, had become a national security asset too valuable to discuss over unsecured lines. That night, I allowed myself one small indulgence. I framed the newspaper article and hung it in my office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder, the most powerful confrontations aren't fought with shouting, but with irrefutable proof of your worth. And sometimes, the most satisfying revenge is simply outranking your detractors. The email from the Army Times arrived on a Tuesday morning with the subject line, "Interview request, Women in Modern Military Intelligence." At first, I nearly deleted it, my standard response to media inquiries. But the journalist's follow-up message gave me pause. "We've spoken with Generals Rothschild and Montgomery about your work at Cyber Command. On background, they described your 2018 predictive analysis that disrupted the Jakarta cell as the new gold standard for tactical prevention." My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't just another puff piece. Rothschild and Montgomery were old-school infantry officers, the kind whose endorsements carried weight in the exact circles my father respected. If they were going on record about my contributions that had been classified until recently, it signaled something bigger than personal vindication. The military itself was rewriting the narrative. I agreed to the interview under strict conditions. No family mentions, no personal drama, just a professional discussion about evolving intelligence methodologies. The reporter, a sharp-eyed veteran named Coulson, nodded when I laid out my terms. Frankly, Major, your service record is compelling enough without the human interest angle, he said, setting up his recorder. Though I suspect your father's crowd will find the human interest anyway. He wasn't wrong. When the article dropped 2 weeks later, From Data to Defense, How Next-Gen Intel Officers Are Redefining Modern Warfare, it featured a sidebar with pull quotes from commanders I'd worked with, all praising operational outcomes tied to my analysis. Buried halfway down was Rothschild's killer line. Major Vasa's work has prevented more enemy engagements than most frontline units ever encounter. The impact was immediate. Colleagues who'd never given me more than polite nods now stopped me in Pentagon corridors. My inbox flooded with speaking invitations from war college seminars and NATO working groups. Even the Secretary of Defense referenced my Jakarta model during a press briefing, calling it the future of threat interception. But the real shift came through back channels. A West Point classmate forwarded me an email chain circulating among retired generals, my father's inner circle. The subject line, that Army Times piece. One particularly telling message read, Danny, you never mentioned your daughter worked with Strickland at Cyber. Hell of a pedigree there. I printed that email and added it to my growing dossier, right behind the White House photo and Montgomery's performance reviews. The institutional validation was achieving what years of arguments never could, forcing my family's hand. When my mother called for the first time in months, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was all strained cheer. We saw your lovely article. Your father wants to know if you'll be home for Memorial Day. As if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't spent years erasing my service. The true turning point came unexpectedly. While testifying before the House Armed Services Committee about emerging cyber threats, Representative Cole, Republican Texas, interrupted his own questioning to say, Major, I've reviewed your service record at General Montgomery's insistence. Frankly, it's criminal how little the public knows about officers like you. The C-SPAN cameras zoomed in as he entered my Jakarta findings into the official congressional record, something no amount of family dismissal could negate. That night, the Defense Department announced my nomination for the Legion of Merit. The citation would remain classified, but the press release specifically cited exceptional contributions to national security through innovative intelligence integration. Admiral Halsey handed me the paperwork with a smirk. Congratulations. You're now officially too decorated to be anyone's disappointment. The most telling reaction came via text from Liam. Did you really brief the Joint Chiefs at 29? Dad says that's not possible. I didn't respond. Let him sit with that cognitive dissonance. Let my father comb through decades of Army Times archives looking for proof. The record stood regardless of their belief. By the time the Legion of Merit ceremony rolled around, something fundamental had changed. Not in them, I had no illusions about sudden enlightenment, but in how the world perceived our dynamic. Colleagues who'd once awkwardly changed the subject when I mentioned my family now openly scoffed at their willful ignorance. The institutional shift had granted me something more valuable than vindication, the freedom to stop caring whether they ever understood. As I stood at attention in the Pentagon auditorium, the metal's weight settling against my uniform, I realized this was the confrontation I'd needed all along. Not a shouting match or a dramatic showdown, but the inexorable tide of official recognition proving what I'd known all along: my worth wasn't negotiable. It was documented. When the photographers asked me to turn toward the press pool, I made sure my smile reached my eyes for the first time in years. Let the image circulate. Let it surface at family gatherings and veterans reunions. The military had spoken, and its verdict was final. The White House invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with the presidential seal in crisp relief. Not the standard electronic calendar alert for routine briefings, but the physical kind reserved for state dinners and diplomatic receptions. The event, a private ceremony honoring intelligence officers for extraordinary contributions to national security. The RSVP deadline had already passed. Someone had hand-delivered this to bypass regular channels. I ran my thumb over the raised seal, feeling the texture of institutional power beneath my fingertips. 6 months ago, my father's voice had boomed across a dinner table, declaring me a failure to our entire family. Now the Commander-in-Chief's office was quietly insisting I attend what the intelligence community called the No Press, No Politics Awards, an event so discreet its existence was never officially confirmed. The kind where medals changed hands before the recipients' names ever appeared on public rolls. Admiral Halsey's aide found me staring at the invitation in my Pentagon office. "The Admiral says to wear your dress blues with full ribbons," she announced, placing a velvet box on my desk. Inside lay a silver lapel pin shaped like an olive branch encircling a sword, the NSC's highest civilian honor. "And she asked me to remind you that classified awards still count on your permanent record, even if you can't post photos." The ceremony itself lasted precisely 23 minutes. No speeches. No press pool. Just the president moving down a line of 7 intelligence personnel, pinning medals to lapels with quiet words no one else could hear. When he reached me, his hands paused slightly as he attached the pin. "Admiral Halsey tells me you declined our original nomination for this last year," he murmured, adjusting the clasp. "Something about unfinished business." I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead at the portrait of George Washington hanging across the Roosevelt room. "The mission wasn't complete yet, sir." His quiet chuckle warmed the air between us. "Well, Major Voss, according to the CIA director, your predictive model just helped us avert a biological attack in Frankfurt." His fingers brushed imaginary dust from my shoulder. "I'd say that qualifies as mission accomplished." The weight of the pin felt different from my military decorations. This wasn't just recognition, it was access. The kind that opened doors no amount of family connections could breach. As we filed out, a discreet hand passed me an embossed card with a phone number and single directive: call en route to Andrews. The car ride to Joint Base Andrews passed in silence, the armored Suburbans' tinted windows turning the world outside into a blur of muted colors. I dialed the number. A male voice answered with the clipped efficiency of career military. "Major Voss, this is Colonel Briggs from the White House Military Office. Effective 0800 tomorrow, you're assigned to the NSC's Emerging Threats Directorate as Special Advisor. This constitutes a lateral move with TS/SCI clearance upgrade." A pause. "Your father's security liaison at CENTCOM submitted an inquiry about your status last week. For your file notations, we've restricted his access to your duty assignments." The irony tasted richer than the French roast I'd sipped at the ceremony. My father, who'd spent my childhood lecturing about the chain of command, now found himself blocked by it. The system he worshipped now protecting me from his scrutiny. None of it needed to be. The only audience that mattered was the small circle of professionals who understood what these quiet acknowledgments meant. I kept every document. The secure briefcase in my London flat grew heavier each week, not with weapons or cash, but with paper. Performance evaluations from generals who outranked my father. Thank you notes from ambassadors whose embassies still stood because of my warnings. Even a handwritten card from the president's national security advisor after the Frankfurt operation. "You make the impossible look routine." These weren't just mementos, they were tactical assets. Every piece of paper represented a thread in the safety net I'd woven, one no amount of family disdain could cut through. When the Pentagon finally declassified portions of my Jakarta operation for a congressional hearing, I didn't attend. Admiral Halsey read my testimony instead. "Major Voss is currently engaged in time-sensitive operations," she told the committee, her tone leaving no room for questions. The phrase time-sensitive operations carried weight in those halls, a polite way of saying I was somewhere doing something too important to interrupt. My father heard that message loud and clear. His first email in 6 months arrived the day after the hearing, sent to my official.mil address because he no longer had my personal contact. The subject line, "Congratulations on Jakarta." The body contained exactly 3 sentences, meticulously stripped of any emotional inflection, a military after-action report masquerading as familial communication. I archived it without response, but not before noticing his signature block, Daniel Voss, Major General, retired, beneath my own Major Sienna Voss, NSC Special Advisor. The hierarchy was finally right side up. The true measure of my reclaimed legacy came unexpectedly. While reviewing threat assessments at DIC headquarters, a junior analyst paused at my door. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, your West Point thesis on asymmetric cyber warfare is required reading at Sandhurst now." He held up a dog-eared copy of the redacted document. Changed my whole approach to counterterrorism. I stared at the paper, remembering how my father had scoffed when I chose that thesis topic. "Stick to infantry tactics if you want to be taken seriously," he'd said. Now cadets at Britain's premier military academy were studying my work. That night, I walked along the South Bank, watching the London Eye glow against the night sky. Somewhere across the Atlantic, my family was probably gathered around another dinner table, telling stories about Liam's latest promotion or Naomi's medical breakthroughs. My name might come up in passing, met with awkward silences or dismissive jokes about spy games. It no longer mattered. Legacy isn't what your family says about you at gatherings. It's what professionals whisper in secure briefing rooms. It's the protocols that bear your name long after you've left the service. It's the young analysts who study your work without knowing your face. The Thames current swirled dark beneath Westminster Bridge, carrying centuries of secrets out to sea. I dropped a single penny into the water, not for luck, but as a token. A quiet acknowledgement that some battles aren't won with fanfare, but through the slow, inexorable accumulation of respect. My father could keep his war stories. I had the future. The email from the Army Historical Foundation arrived on a rainy London morning. They were compiling an oral history of modern military intelligence and requested an interview about my predictive analysis models. Attached was a list of confirmed participants: General Rothschild, Admiral Strickland, and at the bottom, my father's name with Rhett, in parentheses. I stared at the attachment while rain streaked the windows of my Kensington flat. This was the moment I'd fantasized about during countless family dinners, the public reckoning where my accomplishments would force him to acknowledge his mistake. But as I read the email again, something unexpected happened. The old hunger for vindication didn't flare. Instead, I felt a quiet detachment, like observing a tactical scenario where the outcome no longer affected my operations. I declined the interview with polite professionalism, citing ongoing classified work. Not to deny him the confrontation, but because I genuinely didn't require it anymore. The truth of my career existed in too many secure databases, too many official records for his disapproval to matter. Revenge would have been satisfying in a petty way, but true power lay in making his opinion irrelevant. My assistant interrupted my thoughts with a secure tablet. "Ma'am, you're needed at Thames House. The DG wants your assessment before the PM's briefing." I grabbed my coat, leaving the email open on my desk. The work continued with or without my father's approval. At MI5 headquarters, the Director General handed me a threat assessment bearing the seal of a nation my father had deployed to during his active service. "Their cybersecurity minister specifically requested you consult on this," he said. "Called you the architect of modern preventative intelligence." The label would have infuriated my father. He still believed real soldiers won wars with rifles and grit. I spent the afternoon mapping attack vectors with analysts half my age. One lieutenant kept sneaking glances at my uniform ribbons. "Ma'am," he finally ventured during a coffee break, "is it true you predicted the Karachi plot using only shipping manifests?" The story had become legend in certain circles, exaggerated with each retelling. I gave him the unclassified version. His eyes widened when I mentioned cross-referencing weather patterns. "That's brilliant," he breathed, and in that moment, I understood something fundamental. The lieutenant's admiration wasn't for medals or rank, it was for craft. For solving puzzles others couldn't see. That pure professional respect mattered more than any family approval ever could. Back at my flat, I found a package from the Pentagon. Inside lay a leather-bound folder containing my newly declassified service record. Not the sanitized version, but the complete operational timeline. Flipping through the pages, I saw my career laid bare. Every successful prediction, every averted crisis, every commendation my father had dismissed as bureaucratic participation trophies. The final page bore the Secretary of Defense's signature above 3 words: historic, unprecedented, invaluable. I placed the folder beside the unopened Christmas card from my mother. The contrast spoke volumes, one acknowledging my professional worth in official terms, the other still addressed to some ghost version of me they hoped I'd become. That night, I walked through St. James's Park as twilight deepened. Somewhere in Virginia, my father was probably holding court at some veterans event, telling embellished stories about Fallujah. The thought no longer stirred bitterness. Let him have his glory days. I had something better, the quiet certainty that came from knowing my work had saved lives. That my legacy would outlast his outdated notions of valor. A text buzzed in my pocket. Admiral Halsey, concise as ever, Jakarta model just prevented an embassy siege in Nairobi. POTUS wants you at the table for the Africa Strategy Review. I pocketed the phone without responding, watching a swan glide across the pond's dark surface. This was the victory he'd never understand, not needing to prove anything to him anymore. The greatest revenge wasn't confrontation. It was thriving beyond his imagination. The work continued. The record stood. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, the kind used for official correspondence, with no return address. The postmark showed it had originated in Washington, but the handwriting was unmistakably my father's, precise block letters that looked like they'd been carved into the paper with military efficiency. I set it on my desk in the Kensington flat and stared at it while finishing my morning coffee, treating it with the same detached caution I'd give an unidentified package at a security checkpoint. 3 weeks had passed since the Nairobi operation made front-page news in intelligence circles. My father would have seen the classified bulletins through his remaining Pentagon contacts, though his access level now barred him from operational details. The timing wasn't accidental. This letter represented either surrender or one final tactical maneuver I needed to assess which before engaging. I slit the envelope with a letter opener, the blade catching the morning light. Inside lay a single sheet of West Point stationery, the crest slightly faded from age. The date at the top showed he'd written this on the anniversary of my graduation, a fact he'd never acknowledged in person. The message contained just 12 words. Your service record speaks for itself. I should have listened sooner. No apology. No request for reconciliation. Just the barest acknowledgement that the official documentation had finally outweighed his prejudice. I folded the letter along its original creases and slid it back into the envelope. This wasn't about forgiveness, it was about verification. After years of dismissal, he'd been forced to consult the same institutional records that now protected my career from his disapproval. I placed the envelope in my fireproof safe beside the declassified service records and the unopened Christmas cards. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. These artifacts of our fractured relationship now literally locked away while my active work continued uninterrupted. That afternoon at Thames House, while reviewing surveillance footage of a suspected arms dealer, my secure line buzzed. Admiral Halsey's voice carried its usual no-nonsense tone. The president wants you back stateside next month. We're standing up a new counterterrorism task force, and your name came up unanimously. She paused just long enough to make the next words land. General Rothschild will be your military liaison. The significance wasn't subtle. Rothschild had been my father's commanding officer in Iraq, one of the few men whose opinion he still respected. Now he'd be reporting through channels to me. The institutional chess pieces had aligned into perfect, unspoken checkmate. I spent my final week in London walking the city at dawn, memorizing its contours like an operative casing a future meeting site. Along the Victoria Embankment, I passed a street vendor selling military memorabilia. Among the replica medals and unit patches sat a single authentic item, a Vietnam-era army compass nearly identical to the one my father carried during my childhood. The vendor shrugged when I asked its provenance. Estate sale, most likely. I bought it without haggling. Back at my flat, I polished the brass casing until my reflection appeared in its surface. Then I packaged it with the letter and shipped it to my father's Virginia address. No note. No return address. Just the compass he'd once told me separates soldiers from tourists, heading back to him after circumnavigating the globe through my service. On the flight to D.C., I reviewed the task force briefing papers. Page 17 listed my official designation, Director, Joint Threat Assessment Group. The title carried operational authority over 3 combatant commands, including CENTCOM, where my brother now served as a staff officer. The symmetry felt poetic rather than vindictive. The White House car met me at Dulles. As we passed the Pentagon exit on I-395, my phone vibrated with a notification, a security alert showing someone had accessed my father's service record that morning. The search parameters focused on a single date, my West Point graduation. I swiped the alert away and turned to watch the Potomac glide by. Some battles ended not with explosions, but with quiet capitulations, not through force, but through irrefutable evidence. The compass would arrive tomorrow. Let him hold it and wonder whether it was a peace offering or a reminder that true north had always existed beyond his narrow definitions of service. The car merged into the exit lane for the Eisenhower Executive Office building. New work waited. Better work. The kind that left no room for old ghosts or their grudges. Closure wasn't a moment. It was a direction, and mine stretched clearly ahead. The envelope arrived at my new Pentagon office 2 weeks after I assumed command of the Joint Threat Assessment Group. No return address, just the familiar block handwriting that once dictated the tone of my childhood. Inside, folded neatly between 2 yellowing copies of Stars and Stripes, was an old photograph, me, in uniform, standing stiffly beside my father at my West Point graduation. He wasn't smiling. I wasn't either. On the back, a single note. This one's always stayed on my desk. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd said. No mention of that dinner where he'd called me a decorated failure in front of everyone. And yet, the gesture spoke clearly. He had finally looked beyond the uniform and medals to see what I had built, not because I had asked him to, but because the world had left him no choice. Recognition doesn't always arrive with a red bow or a tearful reunion. Sometimes it shows up in the way people adjust when they realize they can no longer deny your impact. My father never said the words. He never called, never wrote a second letter. But when General Rothschild, his former commander and closest peer, stood up at a Pentagon briefing to refer to my threat assessment models as foundational, I saw my father's gaze drop quietly to the table. And he nodded. Just once. That was enough. Outside of family, the recognition came louder. At my promotion ceremony, Admiral Halsey stood beside the Secretary of Defense and recited a citation that made the room fall silent. For exceptional service and strategic foresight that has redefined the role of military intelligence in counterterrorism operations. Applause thundered around me. No one whispered desk jockey anymore. They whispered next in line for NSC leadership. Even my brother Liam, once the golden child, sent a clipped text the next morning. He watched the whole thing. Didn't say much after. Just left the room. I didn't ask for more. I didn't need it. That's what changes when the world starts to reflect back your real image instead of the one your family painted. You stop needing them to rewrite the story. Because now, too many others are telling it accurately. My name appeared in policy journals, internal defense bulletins, and once, anonymously, in a New York Times op-ed that called my Jakarta model the most critical shift in predictive intel since 9/11. They didn't use my face, but they quoted my work. Recognition, I've learned, isn't about people clapping for you. It's about silence, the kind that follows when no one dares diminish what you've done. That silence followed me through secure corridors, briefing rooms, and late-night ops calls. Not reverence, not fame. Just respect. Quiet. Earned. My mother never mentioned the dinner again. She sent a birthday card that year, light on sentiment, heavy on neutral phrases like stay safe and we're proud of you. But even that was different. It had taken her decades to use the word proud. I held onto the card not for warmth, but as proof. Proof that something had shifted, even if they'd never admit it outright. That's the thing about truth. You don't always need it shouted. You just need it known. And now it was. So I let them carry on with their silences, their small gestures, their avoidance of the past. I had nothing left to prove to them. The world had already done that for me. The office at Langley was temporary. Bare walls, standard issue desk, no nameplate on the door. I liked it that way. Titles didn't interest me anymore. Influence did. And from this room, the pulse of global intelligence passed through my fingertips daily. I wasn't chasing recognition anymore. I was building something bigger. They called the initiative Sentinel a joint U.S, U.K, predictive operations unit, quietly founded after the Nairobi and Frankfurt intercepts. I didn't name it. I didn't need to. But I wrote its doctrine, trained its analysts, and when new recruits asked who designed the intel flow systems, someone in the room always whispered, "That's Voss's model." It wasn't the kind of legacy my father could brag about at reunions. There were no banners, no ceremonies, no gold-trimmed plaques. Just results. Quiet, life-saving results. And that was enough. I'd moved into a small townhome just outside Georgetown, something modest, sun-filled, detached from the high walls and silent expectations of my childhood home in Virginia. No family photos on the mantle. Just a single framed document, a satellite image of a building in Jakarta, time-stamped, with the words, "Mission aborted, civilian presence confirmed," printed in the margin. My algorithm caught that detail before any boots hit the ground. It saved 41 lives. That mattered more to me than any ribbon or headline. My circle had changed. No more stilted holiday dinners or pitying glances across linen-covered tables. Now my conversations happened in secured conference rooms, on encrypted calls, in quiet coffees with analysts and operatives who respected what I'd built, not who I was related to. Naomi still checked in text messages every few weeks, a postcard when she traveled. She'd left the hospital for a research position in Geneva. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. Some wounds didn't require stitching, only distance. I hadn't spoken to my father since the compass arrived. I never would. What would I say? That I no longer carried the weight of needing to be understood? That I no longer measured myself by his definitions of strength? That the systems he once served now served me? No. He had made peace with the illusion he needed to survive. And I had outgrown it. Instead, I poured everything into my work. Quietly, fiercely, deliberately. I mentored junior officers. I designed next-gen threat models. I helped rewrite the training pipeline for intelligence cadets so they no longer had to fight for legitimacy behind closed doors. They wouldn't have to walk the path I did, not alone anyway. And in the quiet of early mornings, when the Potomac fog rolled in and the world was still, I sometimes thought about the girl I used to be, the one standing at attention at her first promotion ceremony, eyes scanning the crowd for a father who showed up late and left early. She's not here anymore. In her place stands someone who needs no audience, no applause, just impact. One evening, I walked alone along the National Mall, the white glow of the Lincoln Memorial behind me, the Capitol lights ahead. Tourists passed with cameras and laughter. I kept my hands in my coat pockets and my head high. A child ran past, clutching a toy compass. I smiled. Strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it simply moves forward quietly, confidently, without looking back.